The Murphy family had long been a quiet, unremarkable fixture in the small, wind-bitten town of Derry Hollow. Tucked into the folds of a gray hillside and surrounded by weeping willow trees, their modest farmhouse stood as a symbol of endurance, passed down through generations. The Murphys weren't wealthy, but they were proud, anchored by old values, strong Catholic faith, and a firm belief in hard work. Patrick Murphy, the father, worked at the local mill while Margaret, his wife, tended to the house and raised their children. Together they had 5 sons, and though times were often tough, they managed to build a life rooted in stability and love. People in town spoke kindly of the Murphys. Patrick was a man of few words, but he was dependable, and Margaret's warmth made her well-loved in the church community. Their boys were like any others, rambunctious, bright-eyed, always chasing one another through the fields and woods that framed their home. For years, nothing about the Murphys suggested anything out of the ordinary. They were like hundreds of families that had come before them, working hard, attending Sunday Mass, dreaming quietly of better days. But time has a way of turning stories sour, and the Murphys' fate would soon slip from ordinary into the realm of the unexplainable. The shift began with their eldest son, Liam. He was the golden boy, the one everyone assumed would go on to do something bigger than the rest. Intelligent, athletic, and endlessly curious, Liam had a sense of purpose uncommon in boys his age. He planned to attend university in the city and study engineering. His 21st birthday was supposed to mark the beginning of that bright chapter. Instead, it became the end. On the morning of his birthday, Liam and a few friends set off on a hiking trip to celebrate. The sun had barely crested the horizon when they reached a bluff overlooking the valley. According to those present, Liam stood near the edge for just a moment, smiling, laughing, taking in the view, when he suddenly lost his balance. The ground, damp from a previous rain, gave way beneath his boots. The fall was swift and unforgiving. By the time the others reached him, he was gone. The town mourned him heavily. A tragedy, they called it. Cruel and untimely, but an accident all the same. Everyone rallied around the Murphys, bringing casseroles, prayers, and hushed condolences. Patrick became more withdrawn after the funeral, and Margaret, though outwardly composed, stopped singing at church. Life trudged on, as it always does after death, but the loss had carved a quiet, aching hole in their household. It might have ended there. Families lose sons. It's part of the cruel arithmetic of life. But it didn't end. Aidan, the second son, turned 21 2 years later. The town remembered Liam's death, but no one believed there could be a connection. People shook their heads at such thoughts. Superstition didn't suit modern minds. Yet when Aidan died in a sudden car crash, just 3 days after his 21st birthday, unease settled over Derry Hollow like a fog that wouldn't lift. At first, it was whispered about in corners of the diner and after Sunday service. Nothing concrete, just speculation. But in the Murphy house, fear had taken root. Something was happening to their boys, something beyond reason. Margaret started lighting candles for hours at a time, and her eyes grew heavy with something more than grief. Patrick, usually stoic, was seen arguing with the priest late one evening behind the chapel. They were searching for answers, though no one outside the family knew exactly what they feared. By the time the third son approached his 21st birthday, there was no more casual dismissal. The Murphys had stopped mentioning the milestone altogether. Friends of the family avoided the topic, and neighbors watched with nervous eyes. The idea that something, some kind of force or curse, was haunting the family had crept from hushed rumors to a cold, widely accepted dread. The once unremarkable Murphy family had become a chilling legend in the making. The pattern was only just beginning. Liam Murphy was the first to die, and at the time, No one thought it was anything more than a tragic accident. The Murphys were a tight-knit Irish-American family living on the outskirts of a quiet New England town, and Liam, their eldest son, was the kind of boy neighbors described as too full of life to ever die young. He was athletic, smart, with a charm that could quiet a room or stir it into laughter within moments. When he turned 21, the family threw a modest party, just close relatives, a few friends, and homemade cake in the backyard under strung-up lights. A week later, Liam went on a weekend hiking trip with two of his college friends. They chose Bear Cliff Ridge, a popular spot with panoramic views and steep trails, beautiful but not particularly dangerous, especially for someone like Liam who had hiked it before. The morning started clear, skies blue with only a breeze moving through the trees. According to his friends, they had reached one of the higher points along the trail, stopped for photos and water, and were about to head back down when it happened. The official report stated he slipped, that he must have wandered a little off path, perhaps to get a better view or take a picture, and misjudged his footing. He fell nearly 80 feet into a ravine. By the time rescue crews arrived, he was gone. His body was found sprawled across mossy rock, his head injured, his limbs broken. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was ruled accidental, open and shut. But for his parents, Patrick and Margaret Murphy, it wasn't so simple. Margaret especially was convinced something was wrong. Liam was cautious, especially on hikes. He wasn't the reckless type. The idea that he would have lost his footing, especially on terrain he knew, struck her as uncharacteristic. She even said once, months after the funeral, that she'd had a dream a few nights before the trip. In it, she'd seen Liam standing alone on the edge of a cliff, facing away from her. No matter how loudly she screamed, he wouldn't turn around. The townsfolk mourned, of course. Small towns always do. There were casseroles, late-night visits, hugs that lingered too long, and a closed casket funeral with rows of neighbors weeping for a boy taken far too soon. But in a place where whispers travel faster than truth, stories began to bloom. Some said Liam had been pushed, that maybe he'd gotten involved in something he shouldn't have. Others said it was nature's cruelty, no more. A few older residents, remembering Irish folklore and the idea of family curses, mentioned strange things with hushed voices about the old country, about bloodlines, about spirits. The Murphys didn't listen, or at least tried not to. They buried Liam, cleaned out his room, and tried to carry on. Patrick went back to work at the local carpentry shop. Margaret spent her time in the garden. The remaining sons, Aidan and Caleb, went back to school. But something had shifted. The brightness in the house dimmed. There was a silence in the hallways that hadn't been there before, and most of all, there was unease, a quiet, constant worry that something had been set in motion. For Aidan, the middle son, it was the beginning of his own countdown, though he didn't know it yet. He was 18 at the time, with 3 years before he reached the same age. His behavior changed subtly. He became more careful, more introspective, less inclined to go on spontaneous trips or accept dares from his friends. Margaret noticed, and though she never said it out loud, she had already begun to fear that Liam's death was more than an accident. Even now, years later, people look back at that weekend on Bear Cliff Ridge and wonder. Liam's friends never quite recovered from what they saw. One of them, Mark, moved away shortly after the funeral and stopped responding to messages. The other, Tom, became unusually quiet and withdrawn. He never spoke much about the hike, except once to a local reporter. He said there was a moment, just before the fall, when Liam turned around and looked at him. Not scared, not shouting, just looked as if he knew. That was the beginning of the grim story that would follow the Murphy family for years to come. When the second Murphy son, Aidan, died just days after turning 21, the lingering sadness from Liam's death turned into something far more sinister: dread. Aidan had always been the cautious one. Where Liam was adventurous and carefree, Aidan was thoughtful and grounded. After losing his older brother, he took on the silent role of protector in the family, trying his best to fill the vacuum that Liam left behind. He avoided risks, rarely went out, and even delayed getting his driver's license. Yet, despite every effort to live cautiously, fate, or something darker, seemed determined to find him. It was a cold March night when Aidan lost his life. He had only recently celebrated his 21st birthday. Friends had tried to convince him to go out and have a drink to mark the occasion, but he declined. He stayed home, had dinner with his family, and went to bed early. The next morning, his mother found him in the garage, slumped against the wall. The carbon monoxide from the still-running car had taken his life silently in the night. The police ruled it accidental. He had gone out late, maybe to get something from the car, they said, and mistakenly left the engine running, but his mother never believed that. Margaret Murphy was the kind of woman who paid attention to details. Aidan was meticulous. He never left lights on, let alone a car engine. And there were small things that didn't add up. The garage door was closed, but no one had heard it open or shut during the night. The house was quiet, and nothing triggered the family dog, who barked even at the slightest sound. Margaret told the officers that something was wrong, that this wasn't a simple accident. But there was no evidence to suggest otherwise, no signs of foul play, and certainly nothing that would justify further investigation. The death certificate listed accidental poisoning. The community mourned, but privately people began to murmur. The idea of a curse took root among the neighbors. At first it was just superstitious whispers. 2 boys from the same family dying at the exact same age, one from a fall and one from carbon monoxide. It strained belief. Some speculated about a family vendetta. Others thought maybe the Murphys were involved in something unspeakable. But none of these theories ever made it beyond rumor. Yet Margaret couldn't let it go. She had buried 2 sons before either had a chance to live their lives, and something inside her screamed that this wasn't over. She began researching family history late into the night, scouring old documents, diaries, and town records. She spoke with a local historian who helped trace the Murphy bloodline back to Ireland, to a coastal village where legend spoke of a deal made by one of their ancestors, a pact for prosperity sealed with a sacrifice every generation. Of course, this sounded absurd to most. Old folklore and ghost stories were part of every Irish family's history. But Margaret wasn't dismissing anything anymore. It wasn't long after Aidan's funeral that she began seeing patterns. She noticed the date of Liam's death matched the date her great-uncle had died, also at 21 in 1946. She found photos and obituaries of other male relatives who died young, most of them never reaching 22. She pieced together a timeline that no one else had ever noticed or wanted to see. The fear that gripped her was no longer vague or nameless. It was targeted, specific. Something was taking the Murphy sons, and it was only a matter of time before it came again. The household changed after Aidan's death. The remaining children, particularly the youngest son, Ethan, were kept under a tight watch. Margaret stopped working. She homeschooled Ethan. She got rid of the car. The house was filled with candles, protective charms, and even a small shrine with holy water and old relics from her family's past. The once lively Murphy home grew dim, not just from the grief, but from a deep, creeping sense of inevitability. As Ethan inched closer to his own 21st birthday, Margaret's desperation grew. But she couldn't unwrite the story, and deep down, she feared it was already sealed. Aidan's death wasn't an accident. It was a pattern repeating itself quietly and mercilessly. Yeah. As each of the Murphy sons grew into adolescence, an unsettling atmosphere hung heavily over the family home. What once was a place of warmth and laughter had become a quiet, watchful house filled with dread. After the deaths of Liam and Aidan, both on the cusp of adulthood, both at age 21, the family could no longer pretend these were isolated tragedies. Their parents, Margaret and Sean Murphy, became consumed by a singular, desperate goal: to protect their remaining sons from a fate that felt increasingly inevitable. Fear dictated everything. The Murphy boys were not allowed to go out alone. They missed out on school trips, parties, even ordinary errands like riding their bikes to the corner store. Every potential risk was scrutinized, every choice questioned. It wasn't parenting anymore. It was containment. Margaret, once a bright and strong-willed woman, grew hollow-eyed and superstitious, clinging to rituals and relics from her Catholic upbringing. She hung crosses in every room, lit candles daily, and called on priests to bless the house more times than anyone could count. Sean became distant and grim, unable to process the weight of what was happening, his silence speaking volumes more than his words ever could. The boys, especially the middle ones, Connor and James, felt the walls closing in as they neared adulthood. As each turned 20, the air in the house seemed to tighten. Birthday celebrations were no longer joyous. They were anxious, quiet acknowledgments that another year had passed, and the most dangerous one now lay ahead. Connor tried to joke about it, calling it the family curse, even laughing with his friends outside the house to cope. But inside, he watched his mother's face twist in fear every time he left the room. That fear wore him down. When Connor turned 21, his parents nearly begged him to stay indoors for the entire year. They turned their house into a fortress. Cameras, reinforced locks, even a hired security guard for the first few months. But the grip of death, whatever its source, seemed to operate on its own timeline, unbothered by precautions. Connor died in his sleep on the night of his 21st birthday. The autopsy revealed a sudden cardiac arrest, despite no medical history and no warning signs. There was nothing the doctors could explain, nothing they could fix. By the time James reached adulthood, he was no longer skeptical. He saw his brothers fall one by one. He didn't believe in curses at first. He thought his family was just tragically unlucky. But with Connor's death, that belief crumbled. He didn't leave his room for weeks before his 21st. He kept journals, letters, even recorded messages, convinced he wouldn't make it. His parents took every measure, more extreme this time. No contact with the outside world, monitored meals, therapists, shamans, even exorcists. Still, James died from an aneurysm while brushing his teeth just 3 weeks after his birthday. Once again, it was sudden. Once again, inexplicable. What haunted the Murphy parents most wasn't just the loss, but the helplessness of it all. No matter what they did, death came. Not as a result of rebellion, not through neglect, but despite their vigilance. The more they tried to resist it, the more inevitable it became. Their house became quieter with each son lost. The laughter was gone. The walls seemed to breathe with sorrow, every photo frame on the mantel becoming a monument to a life cut short. The youngest, Ethan, grew up in this environment of fear and mourning. From a young age, he was told stories of his brothers, not in celebration, but in warning. Don't go out after dark. Don't ride in cars. Don't make friends with strangers. Don't talk about your birthday. His entire childhood was a lesson in avoidance. He was loved, but the kind of love twisted by desperation, smothering rather than sustaining. By the time he turned 20, Ethan didn't ask questions. He knew what came next. He didn't plead for freedom. He didn't rebel. He only asked to be allowed to leave, to go far away, to hide from whatever had taken his brothers. His parents agreed reluctantly. With help from distant relatives, Ethan moved to another state, changed his name, and disappeared from the public eye. It felt like hope, fragile and faint, but hope nonetheless. But just over a month after Ethan turned 21, he was found dead in a motel room alone. There were no signs of trauma, no drugs, no indication of suicide. The cause of death was never determined. The Murphy family never recovered. Ethan Murphy was different from his brothers in many ways. He was quieter, more observant, and had grown up in the long, cold shadow of his siblings' deaths. By the time he turned 16, the whispered warnings in his household had grown into outright rules. He wasn't allowed to walk alone at night, drive a car, or take part in sports that might carry the slightest risk. The Murphy household, once filled with the laughter of 5 boys, had been reduced to silence and superstition, its walls heavy with dread. Every tick of the clock brought Ethan closer to the age that had claimed each of his brothers, 21. As his 21st birthday approached, Ethan became desperate. He didn't want to die, and unlike his brothers, he had time to prepare. He studied every detail of their lives, scoured newspaper clippings, and pored over his mother's journals that she kept hidden in the attic. The entries were erratic, riddled with grief and guilt. She had written about dreams, dark, repetitive visions of shadowy figures, and cryptic warnings from a long-dead relative. She had begged God for an answer, but none had ever come. It was in those journals Ethan found the first mention of the pact. The word meant little to him at first, but over time pieces began to connect. An old letter buried between the pages suggested that the Murphy family had once been involved in a strange spiritual agreement, one that dated back to famine-era Ireland. In exchange for survival during hard times, a vow had been made, one that promised something precious from each generation. Whether that was superstition or the ramblings of a grieving mother, Ethan didn't know. But what chilled him more than anything was the fact that his brothers had all died in ways no one could have predicted, even when protected. It didn't feel random. It felt designed. With his birthday only months away, Ethan did something radical. He vanished. No phone calls, no traceable emails. He told only one person, his childhood friend Olivia, where he was going. She helped him secure a secluded cabin far north, deep in the Adirondack wilderness, and agreed to bring him supplies once a week. It was quiet, far from cities or roads, and beyond the reach of fate, or so he believed. At first, the solitude gave him hope. He meditated, wrote letters to his future self, tried to envision a life beyond 21. The days passed slowly, each one a small victory. Olivia visited regularly, their exchanges brief but grounding. She brought books, home-cooked meals, and reassurances. For a time, Ethan believed he had outsmarted whatever force had haunted his family. He made it through his birthday without incident. There was no storm, no ghost, no sudden accident. Just a sunrise, a breath of cold air, and the trembling hope that maybe the curse had finally died with fear itself. But 1 week after his birthday, Olivia arrived to find the cabin door wide open and Ethan gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no scattered belongings. His jacket still hung on the hook, untouched. His journal lay open on the table. The final entry was written with a steady hand, and its last line simply read, "I feel it watching me tonight." A full-scale search followed involving local authorities, volunteers, and drones. They scoured the woods for days, finding only a single footprint near the edge of a frozen stream, too shallow to be of much use. A coroner's report was inconclusive. When Ethan's body was discovered 2 weeks later, Lying peacefully on a flat stone near the base of a mountain, there were no visible injuries, no trauma, no signs of exposure or starvation. It was as if life had simply left him. His death added a final layer of mystery to a story already steeped in sorrow. With no answers and no leads, the case was closed. Olivia never spoke publicly about the events, but locals say she stopped talking entirely for a time. Some believe Ethan succeeded in breaking the curse by surrendering himself willingly. Others say he was simply the last offering. The Murphy family line ended with Ethan. Their home, shuttered and silent, remains untouched on the outskirts of town, choked by ivy and time. Despite years of investigation, the tragic saga of the Murphy family has left more questions than answers. After the death of Ethan, the youngest son, the air around the family name thickened with suspicion, dread, and myth. What began as a tragic coincidence had long spiraled into a narrative of fatalism and fear, so much so that even those close to the family began to wonder whether something unnatural had taken hold. The town where the Murphys lived, once a quiet and modest community, became a point of morbid interest for outsiders. Journalists, amateur investigators, and even paranormal researchers made their way to the crumbling Murphy home, hoping to uncover something that might explain the grim pattern. But no matter how many people tried to piece it together, the mystery remained impenetrable. The local authorities had long closed the official investigations into the deaths, chalking each up to misfortune, coincidence, or in some cases, undetermined medical anomalies. But the timing, each death occurring around or shortly after the boys' 21st birthdays, left too neat a pattern for anyone to accept mere chance. A few particularly driven individuals went through hospital records, autopsy reports, and even childhood medical histories, hoping to find a genetic defect or underlying condition that could link the brothers' deaths. Nothing ever came of it. The brothers were healthy, with no known predispositions, and each cause of death was different. Accidents, unexplained trauma, sudden illness. Different circumstances, same outcome. The community's older residents often whispered about the Murphy land itself, suggesting that something had been wrong with it since before the family ever moved there. Some spoke of an unmarked burial ground hidden deep in the woods behind the property, or a man who had cursed the land during a long-forgotten dispute. Others pointed to Margaret Murphy's rumored trips to fortune-tellers and priests, saying she must have known something dark was in motion. A few claimed to have seen her burning strange herbs on the porch or burying objects in the garden, rituals that made no sense to them but were clearly performed with desperate purpose. Whether these stories were true or twisted by time and gossip, they became part of the story, inseparable from the facts. After Ethan's death, Margaret disappeared. Some say she went mad with grief. Others believe she left town quietly and lives under a different name, forever haunted by the loss of all four of her sons. The Murphy house, now a sagging, weather-worn structure overtaken by weeds and moss, stands as a grim monument to their memory. The mailbox still bears their name, rusted and barely legible. No one has bought the property. Attempts to sell it have always fallen through, even when the price was dropped to almost nothing. The few people who've entered claim they felt something, an overwhelming sense of pressure or sorrow, cold spots that lingered too long, or strange whispers with no source. Whether these are genuine phenomena or the power of suggestion, no one can say. But none have stayed long. The story of the Murphy sons has become a cautionary tale, a ghost story told around fires or whispered in low voices when someone turns 21. It's found its way into obscure podcasts, conspiracy forums, and even a handful of documentaries. Still, no one has been able to explain why four boys from the same family, each full of life and promise, Each fell to death before they could step fully into adulthood. There is no solid thread tying it together, no cult, no scientific cause, no criminal involvement, just a quiet, relentless tragedy that visited one family again and again, as if guided by some invisible hand. To this day, the Murphy name evokes silence. Those who knew them rarely speak of it unless pressed, and even then, their voices lower, their eyes drift. The sense that something was taken from the family, stolen, not lost, still hangs heavy. Whatever truly happened may never be known, and perhaps that's what makes the story so chilling. It isn't just what happened to the Murphy sons, it's that no one could stop it, and no one ever will.